go through 2,000 years of church history in about 30 minutes. So this is going to be almost like a fraternity stunt. But I think I can do it. Before I get to that, I want to make a couple quick notes. First of all, I'm going to be simplifying greatly. I mean, I'm going to be blowing past important events, ignoring important people in locations, and that's just the fact, that's just a function of trying to get all of this together in 30 minutes. Also, this is very important, at a certain point in the story, the history of the church, for the most part, starts to track along with the history of Europe. That is not because Christianity is European. It is actually not a European religion. It's a Middle Eastern religion. But it does that because of a significant historical event. We'll talk about why that is, and so you'll see in a few minutes. Before I start with the history, I want to make a point. We have this idea that ancient history is somehow this distant, vague, hazy set of events that happen, and we can't really know what it is, and these people are so cut off from us, it's almost like they're aliens from another planet, these ancient people. But in fact, history, even ancient history, is not as far back as you think. I'll give you an example. An average human lifespan is about 80 years. Now obviously, some people live longer than that, some people don't make it to 80 years. But when you average it out, 80 years is about the average length of a human life. And throughout history, there have been people who have lived to 80. We know, of course, that the average lifespan in, say, the 1st century in Rome or North Africa was around 35 years old or 40 years old. But that was primarily because of very high infant mortality rates. Children died quite frequently when they were born, and then when they were in their first few years. And so that brought the average way down. In fact, if you made it out of childhood, even in ancient periods, you had a pretty good chance of living a long life. And so there were many people who were 80 years old. This was hardly a rare event. Everyone knew people who were old, even in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century. So 80 years is about the average human life. Now, when Jesus was hanging on the cross in Jerusalem, in around the year, say, 35 AD, there was someone in Jerusalem, let's say someone who's about 20 years old. Given the population of Jerusalem, this is a statistical sure bet. There was someone who was about 20 years old. Maybe he even saw Jesus die on the cross. He lived about 60 more years, and when he turned 80, there was someone else born, say in around the same area. That person lived to be 80. When that person turned 80, there was someone else born. I'm not speaking of specific individuals, but I'm pointing out that there's these chunks of human lifespans here. And so that continued. When that person turned 80, someone else was born. That person turned 80, someone else was born. That continued up to the current day. Now, how many human lifespans do you think separate us from the time of Jesus? 25. Mr. Math, 25. Only 25 average human lifespans separate us from the time of Jesus. How many separate us from, say, the Declaration of Independence? Birth of this country. Hey, math guys. 3. 3 human lifespans separate us in 1776. The Reformation, 6. So, distant history, even ancient history, is not nearly as far back as we think. We all know how fast life goes. It just blows right by. So 25 lifespans, that's nothing. There's almost 20 people in this room. This isn't much. So what we're talking about is not the history of some ancient people that we're cut off from, but our own story, our own predecessors, and insofar as we're part of this church, our family members, the people who are still with us. So with that said, in the 1st century, in the Mediterranean, in the Roman province of Palestine, Jesus of Nazareth was crucified. We've talked about this quite a bit. Crucified around, again, 35 AD. Now, his apostles at that time, when it initially happened, of course, were completely freaked out. They didn't know what was going on. But then they encountered Jesus coming back from the dead a number of different times. And they realized that Jesus was this promised Messiah. Jesus was in fact God, this one who had been foretold. And so they exploded throughout the ancient world, spreading this message. Mark went down to Egypt. Thomas made it possibly as far as India. There's one story, I don't know if it's true or not, we're not entirely sure if it's a legend, but he was actually killed in India. So the apostles, they spread out all throughout the ancient Mediterranean and began to spread Christianity. Well, this was not warmly welcomed by the Roman imperial rulers at this time, because many of them felt that Christianity was a rival for their own authority. Not all, but there were Roman persecutions. There were a lot of also Roman emperors who did not care. They were fine. They left the Christians alone as long as they didn't cause too much public kerfuffle. But there were persecutions, and the worst persecution was with Diocletian. That was the end of the 3rd century. When Diocletian died, however, after some struggles for power, the new emperor was a man named Constantine. And in his move, this crux battle, this key battle that gave him the empire in the west at least, this was the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312, he had this vision of a sign of Jesus, and he heard this voice that said, in this sign, which is the Chi-Rho, it's the PX, if you kind of Greek symbols. He heard this voice saying, in this sign you shall conquer. And so he woke up, and he had his soldiers paint this symbol on their armor and their shields. And the next day, they had a great victory. They defeated the usurper, this Roman usurper guy named Maxentius, who was holding Rome. They took Rome, and he became the emperor, at least the emperor in the West. And he credited this great victory to the Christian God. And so he himself became Christian. And over his reign, and he was emperor for quite a long time, and very significant. We've all heard of Constantine, of course. He turned the empire Christian. Now, the Christianity was not the official religion of the empire. That didn't happen until the end of the century with another emperor. But he was Christian. And of course, if you want to get in good, with the emperor, of course, you want to share the emperor's religion. So for the first time, he made Christianity an allowable religion in the empire. And because he was Christian himself, it was a very influential religion. So all of a sudden, Christianity goes from this period of persecution, where they're being hunted, they're being executed, they're forced to move in hiding, they're forced to have these elaborate rituals to identify other Christians that no one else would be able to tell. Now all of a sudden they're out in public. The emperor himself is a Christian. And so they have to figure out, what does it mean to have a Christian empire? In the early years of Christianity, in the early centuries, they were faced with a lot of different questions. I mean, the very earliest period, even when they were under the persecution, they were trying to figure out, what is Christianity? They had the Bible, they had the words, the teachings that Jesus gave them, but they hadn't put everything together yet. They didn't fully understand what the Trinity was. They didn't fully understand how Scripture could be inspired. They didn't understand a lot of these different things. And so in those early centuries, they were trying to figure out, what is Christianity? And then by the time they had some grasp on that, all of a sudden this pagan anti-Christian empire is now a Christian empire. And now they have to figure out, well, what does it mean for Christianity to mix with a kind of kingdom or a kind of empire? What does that mean? What kind of government would that create? How can Christianity transform the state? That was the big question. Well, at around this time, there was an interesting event happening way off in the east, just north of China. I wish I had a big map, but you're going to have to imagine it. Imagine all the way over in China. We all heard of the Great Wall of China, of course. Quite familiar with that, right? Well, we don't know if this event is connected to the building of the Great Wall, but at least one theory has that it is. And it's a pretty good theory, actually. What happened is the Chinese built this wall across their northern border to protect themselves from this warlike, extremely warlike, nomadic, horse-riding people. No one knows where they came from. No one knows what ethnicity they are. We still don't know, actually. But they were attacking China. And so it got so bad that the Chinese had to build this wall. And so that kept this tribe of people out of there. And so they disappeared then from Chinese records. However, around that time, or shortly thereafter, we have another tribe of extremely warlike, extremely successful, almost unstoppable horse-riding nomads coming from the east. We call them the Huns. Of course, we're all familiar with Attila and the Huns. Attila came later on. But the Huns started to move west. We have no idea why. They came from somewhere north of China. We don't know. Which, again, as I said, we don't know their ethnicity. But they started moving west. And they started bumping into other tribes that they met along the way. The Goths, for example, the Vandals, the Franks, all of these kinds of tribes that we've heard of in other contexts, of the Bulgars, the Burgundians, all of these different people. And they hit these tribes, and then they would go and attack the tribes, and those tribes would flee because they couldn't beat the Huns. And so they would start fleeing west. And so before you know it, you have this cascade of barbarian tribes all moving west, trying to get away from the Huns. And of course the Huns are hot on their trail. And so there's this immense wave of barbarians moving west. And what is west? Well, it's the Roman Empire. And so they're pouring over the borders. The empire, the Roman Empire, was very strong, of course. I mean, at its time, it was the pinnacle of strength in the world. But the Roman Empire had grown weak from some other things, internal civil wars and dissension. But really, even if they were strong, you can't defend against wave after wave after wave of barbarian tribes coming over your borders. And so eventually, the Romans, even though the Huns were defeated in, they were turned back in 451 and then Attila died 3 years later. Even though the Huns were dispersed, nevertheless, the Roman Empire crumbled because there were too many barbarian tribes over the border. Now, this was like the end of the world. Because you have to imagine the Roman Empire, Rome had been around for 1,000 years. The empire had been around for 500 years. I mean, that's twice as long as our country has been around. And so these are people who had grown up centuries, believing that Rome was going to last forever, that everything was peaceful within the Roman Empire. You had trade, you had police, you had property rights. No one could come and just steal your property away. I mean, we have this idea that Rome was like this brutal time, and in some ways it was, but if you're living in the ancient world, that's, if you get in a time machine and head back to the first century, you should make a beeline to Rome, because that's about as good as it gets back at that period in terms of safety. But now all of this is destroyed. And so civilization as they know it is gone. And what you have is, you have all of these different Roman rulers in different parts of Europe and the Middle East and North Africa, all around the Mediterranean. And they're cut off from one another because the empire has fallen. So what do? They have to protect themselves. Now they're bandits, they're barbarian tribes wandering around. And so they build themselves castles. And the old Roman dukes and the old Roman government officials hire out little miniature armies. And they protect their keeps, their castles. This is the beginning of feudalism. See, all of these different things kind of lead to one another. We're going to see how this all kind of connects. But that's how feudalism began, because it was protected. They had to protect themselves from this collapse of civilization. But there was one thing that was holding everything together, and that was the Catholic Church. It was an interesting a point of irony that the Catholic Church, around the time of Diocletian took power in 289, very end of the 3rd century. He took power after this long period of civil wars in Rome. And you had something like 28 emperors in 30 years. I mean, the vast majority of them died, obviously not of natural causes. Well, Diocletian took control, and he stabilized the empire. And he realized that the provinces were much too large for him to rule. And so he had to break them up into little pieces. They were going to be easier to rule. Then he put a leader in each one of them. And the Catholic Church, even though they were persecuted horribly by Diocletian, followed this same structure. Just like he did, they followed it. They followed these little sections of property that he created, and they sent a bishop to each one of them. Diocletian, because he was Diocletian, decided to name these little sections of land after him. And so he called them dioceses. That's why we call our things diocese. Comes from Diocletian, ironically enough.
I never knew that.
So, the Catholic Church, the empire falls, the Catholic Church is the only thing holding everything together. And so, even though civilization in the Roman Empire has fallen, you still have something there. And at this time, as I said, we've got feudalism, we've got barbarians, we've got thieves running around, people fearing for their lives and their safety. Nothing is safe anymore. There are no police systems, nothing like that. And so Christian monks and nuns, these kinds of hermits, began to gather together in castles and in monasteries and in small cities. This happened long before, actually. This actually started in Egypt and then throughout North Africa. But they started to do this all over. And this was particularly important in Europe. Why? Because in Europe, the climate is very wet, and things decay very quickly. And the monks, one of their primary functions wasn't just prayer, and it wasn't just feeding the poor. They did that, certainly. But one of their primary functions was day after day, they would copy books. They would copy the Bible. They would copy not just the Bible, but they would copy the great works of antiquity, the ancient classics from all different cultures. And that was the only way that they could keep these books in existence, because otherwise the parchment would rot in the wet and European climate. In the Middle East and in North Africa, it's very dry and hot. And so documents survive quite easily. That's why we have the Dead Sea Scrolls. After 2,000 years, the Dead Sea Scrolls haven't rotted. You put some parchment in some ground in France, and 50 years later, that's gone. So, insofar as we have anything from the Romans, or anything that comes from that whole strand, not just even the Romans, but anything in that whole Mediterranean region, North Africa, any of those places, we can thank the monks at that time, because that's what they spent their lives doing, copying the books and saving them for the future generations. And at this time, they also created these schools of learning, because you have all of these monks together. They're reading these great classics, they're learning, they're educating themselves, and they're educating each other. And this is the start of the university system. But what's very interesting is not only were they converting themselves, not only were they educating themselves through the classics, but they were actually beginning to influence the barbarians. These illiterate, violent barbarians who actually came from the East. And we know them, of course, by their names. We talk about the Franks, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Sciri, the Gepids, all of these different groups. And they began to become educated, and they began to become converted. The Catholic Church actually civilized the barbarians. Before the Franks came to France, we had the Gauls. The Gauls are the original inhabitants of France, the people that Caesar conquered. But we don't call that region Gaul anymore, except as a slang or as a general label for that region. We call them France, after actually the Franciscans, which are a specific kind of axe that the Franks used to like to fight with. But, so all of this Europe was actually these barbarians who came. It wasn't the original inhabitants. It was something quite different. The barbarians came, they were kind of savages, and Catholicism tamed them and civilized them. Now, something very important was happening around this time, and this is the event that I was alluding to before. This is the event that changed dramatically the course of Christian history. In around 600 in the Arabian Peninsula, a new religion arose called Islam. Apparently illiterate shepherd named Muhammad claimed that he had an encounter with the angel Gabriel. The angel Gabriel communicated to him the words apparently of God, Allah. Allah is just simply the Arabic word for God. It's not Muslim God, it just means God. And unfortunately, the way that Islam spread at that time and throughout a lot of its history was through conquest. And so Islam started around the year 600. Between the years 630 and 730, that was just 1 century, Muslim armies had conquered all of the Middle East, had swept across North Africa, and had crossed from Morocco up into Spain and had taken Spain, and was finally stopped by the armies of the Franks, actually, Charles Martel the Hammer, around the Pyrenees. very famous battle. If that hadn't happened, then Islam would have spread throughout Europe. That's why the story of Christianity turns European. It has nothing to do with Christianity being European. In fact, Christianity was a Middle Eastern religion, and the intellectual head, the intellectual regions of Christianity, where you get the real kind of thought and the refinement, the education, and the culture, that was North Africa and the Middle East. That's where those were. Those were the cultured Christians. They looked down on the Europeans because they were barbarians. They're like one generation civilized. They just come from the country, got that slang, one generation from the country. That's what the barbarians were. And so they were not held in high regard by the educated Christians in North Africa, the educated Christians in modern-day Turkey, or around Syria in Palestine. But when the Muslim armies conquered them, those civilizations were gone. There were no more Christians. That's why we kind of focus on Europe, because there wasn't anything else left, or very little left. And so that's an important turn. Christianity is not a European religion by any stretch, but historical circumstances at that time eliminated 2/3 of the story, and that's the problem. Now, Christianity tangled with Islam for quite a long time, and Islam, of course, had the Holy Land by that time because they conquered the Middle East. And so around the 11th century, Christians would make pilgrimages from Europe to the Middle East to go to the holy sites in the Holy Land. They visit the sites, they pray at different holy spots. And up until that time, the Egyptians, it was the Egyptian Muslims at that time, had the Holy Land. And they had a pretty good relationship with the Christians. They allowed them, they protected them. It was pretty harmonious. But then a new group of Muslims came, the Seljuk Turks, and they came and they conquered the Egyptians. And they were quite violent, quite warlike. And they began to attack the Christian pilgrims. And so after a lot of back and forth and a lot of violence, Pope Urban II called the First Crusade. The Crusades started off with the best of intentions. The Crusades started off with the intention of securing the Holy Land so that pilgrims would be safe going to on their pilgrimages to the Middle East, and also because the Seljuks were threatening to destroy all of the holy sites of Christianity. And so it started off on the right foot. Well, things didn't last on the right foot. The First Crusade ended at the end of, I believe, the 12th century in failure. The Christian armies, the Crusader armies, had the Holy Land for about 70, 80 years, about a century or so. And then they faded out. And then other crusades came. In the end, there were 9 crusades plus a children's crusade and an Albigensian crusade, so you've got 11 or so. It's kind of a mess. They all petered out by the late 13th century. Now, the interesting thing is, even though that was a tragedy and the later crusades were pretty awful, I mean, a real shames to Christianity, something very good came from that. When Christians were over there in the Middle East, holding it, they had their own kind of kingdoms, they came in contact with a lot of old ancient books that they had lost, because again, Europe wet, the barbarians, of course the barbarians didn't help when they're throwing the great works of the ancient world on the fire so they can cook their venison. But so they encountered all of these books and they brought them back. Not only did they encounter these books like Aristotle, which had just been completely lost, but all of these brilliant Muslim thinkers as well. And some of the technology that the Muslims had developed themselves and then also taken from the East, from their encounters with the Hindus and in India. And so they brought these back to Europe. And it caused this kind of cultural explosion in Europe, which led to the Renaissance. This rediscovery of ancient art and beauty and philosophy and mathematics and science. And you had this, Renaissance. You had this amazing transformation in Europe. The Dark Ages, so-called, ended and they turned into the flowering of art and architecture and all of the things that we associate with the Renaissance. And so Christians then began to build and to create sculptures and to spend all of their money doing these different things. And if you ever go to a place like Florence, for example, or Milan or Venice, you see that the product of these things. I mean, some magnificent buildings. But this also led to corruption. This was not a proud period in church history. Not only in the areas where the Renaissance touched on, like northern Italy, around that region, but particularly in the region of Germany. There was a Germany at that time. Germany was came to be in the 19th century, but around that region, there's the German city-states, or the states of the different German princes, there was a lot of corruption in the church. And Martin Luther, in the early 16th century, Martin Luther was an Augustinian monk, and he encountered this corruption. He had his own problems as well. And so he instituted this Reformation. Initially, it was just an attempt to try to just reform the church, but that kind of grew. I mean, Martin Luther was Martin Luther, and so it became a lot more than simple reform. It became the creation of a new form of Christianity, Protestantism. And then, of course, that kind of splintered and exploded out from there. Now, the Reformation, on the one hand, we understand the causes. We can certainly understand the necessity of reforming the church. It absolutely needed to be reformed. There's no question about that. Martin Luther took it to excess because he broke away from the church instead of actually reforming it. But the good thing about the Reformation is it led to what we call the Counter-Reformation. That was the church's response. That's where they said, you know what, there are some points here that he's made that we need to institute. But also his challenge, this challenge of our faith, our religion, our beliefs, is forcing us to think about why we believe the things that we believe and better articulate them. And so, oddly enough, the Reformation produced great fruit in the Counter-Reformation, because you now have this kind of explosion, or almost like a renaissance in Christian thought. Now, at this time, because the people there had rediscovered Aristotle, and rediscovered ancient philosophy, and rediscovered the Muslim philosophers in science, they came to really value reason. Now, reason had always been valued by the church, absolutely, no question about it. But it was almost like this rediscovery, or this revivification of reason. And so out of that developed science, modern science. Up until that point, science was just like philosophy. You know, Aristotle did some observation. He kind of watched how kind of animals lived, and cut them up, and did a little bit of that. But most of his science was really more based on his philosophy and reason. He didn't exactly have the scientific method. But at that time, and we're looking at approaching the 1700s, reason became tied in with observation. People realized that you need to actually look at things. Look at the natural world out here. Use these tools that we've gotten from the Crusades, like telescopes and things, these polished lenses that the Muslims had learned from the Hindus or the Indians. They have all of these new interesting scientific tools. And so modern science is born. Now, this was great. The church had always been a great supporter of science. This is a myth when we imagine that Catholic Church has opposed science. And the great example of this, of course, is Galileo. And actually, this is a good illustrative example of what I'm talking about. Galileo was, of course, an astronomer. And his contribution was that he obviously came to discover, although for all the wrong reasons, he came to believe that, in fact, instead of the universe revolving around the Earth, in fact, the rotating Earth, good heavens. Orbiting, thank you. Yeah. That in fact, the Earth orbits the Sun. The Sun is the center of this galaxy. Well, this was not necessarily a new thought. Actually, Copernicus came up with this idea before him. Father of Copernicus, who was a priest. But the way that Galileo presented this caused some problems. See, this was a scientific theory, and it contradicted what mainstream science believed about the universe. And it was it seemed to be settled from people. But Galileo was saying, nope, this is wrong. The Earth actually goes around the Sun. And not only that, not only does science have to be revised, but actually the Bible needs to be revised as well. Your Christian theology needs to be revised. That's actually what got him in trouble. It had nothing to do with just promoting a scientific theory. It was that he made a claim that not only is this a scientific truth, not a theory, but a truth, but also it's something that it requires the revision of God's inspired revelation as well. See, the interesting thing is the church was not opposing science when it faced down Galileo. The church was actually standing up for established science at that time. It was standing up for mainstream science. It would be very much like if someone came in today and said that, you know, these physical things, this is not actually made up of atoms. Now, obviously, we know atoms aren't the smallest, you know, we know now they're smaller particles, but, you know, so like, you know, this is not made up of atoms. This is actually made up of little beings called pod people. And that's why when you push it down, they actually push back. Now, if you came out with this, people would think you're crazy, right? You've got this outlandish, ridiculous theory. Your proof for it, that it's pushing, you know, the little people are pushing back. I mean, that's stupid, and that's obviously wrong. And so, imagine if 200 years later you find out, guess what? There are little people down there. They're not actually pushing back, but they're little people. That's actually what that is. Amazing. You know, that doesn't mean that you were somehow opposing science when you thought it was initially ridiculous. That's the case of Galileo. Galileo was right in his conclusion that the earth goes around the sun, but his reasons for claiming that, his arguments, are actually wrong. We know that they're actually false. And so the church looked at that, they saw the arguments that were incorrect, saw this theory that seemed completely ridiculous, or at least contrary to mainstream science. And that's what they were opposing, especially when Galileo came out and he was saying, look, this is going to change all theology too. That was the problem with Galileo. So it had nothing to do with the church facing down science. Now this new dependence on reason and observation, this new explosion in Europe at this time, led to what we call the Enlightenment. This is around the 1700s. And the Enlightenment was this movement where reason became something that was almost lionized. It was almost idolized. Reason was the way that we interact with the world. It's the way that we're able to come to truth. And the Enlightenment was a great thing initially, but it went too far. And it got to the point where the Enlightenment thinkers began to reject religion. They said, look, we don't need religion. We don't need faith. We don't need revelation. There is no God. As the saying went, man is the measure of all things. The human being is the ultimate being in the world. There is no God. Human being is the summit of everything that is. And reason is humanity's means of coming to truth. Reason and observation. And so that led to a great surge of anti-Christian thought, anti-clericalism. This led to the French Revolution, where priests and nuns were decapitated. And, everyone was decapitated by the end of that, but at least initially it was this kind of attack on the church. And in the 1700s, the church was kind of knocked back on its feet, kind of like a boxer who gets kind of stunned and gets knocked back. And so it was on the ropes. In the 1800s, it had come back. It responded to the atheism. It responded. It refuted these new philosophies of communism, which said that there is no God, that we can make heaven on earth ourselves. And at the same time, it also responded to something else that arose in the 1800s, the Industrial Revolution. This was actually largely a good thing, because the quality of life and lifespans and health and all of these things skyrocketed after the Industrial Revolution, but there were a lot of problems with that as well. There were, people began to be treated as cogs in some kind of big factory, as though they were a means to an end and not the end itself, which is what people are. They're good, they are the things themselves. They're not tools to be used for some other purpose. And so the church had kind of struck this middle ground between atheistic communism on one side and this kind of industrial revolution gone wild on the other. And it was trying to hold this together. And in this time, the church really started to focus on this idea that every human being has a unique dignity. No matter who they are, where they are, it has nothing to do with where they're from or their race or culture or even religion, but it just has to do with the fact that they are themselves human. They had a tough time, the Catholic Church did, for several hundred years prior to that, because that was also the age of imperialism. This is it kind of happened shortly after the Renaissance, around the mid-15th century, where they started discovering all these other lands and started going and taking over Europe, colonized Africa, colonized the Middle East, of course, went over to the New World, and started to colonize that. And the church was kind of like scrambling, because it's like these explorers are meeting these new people that no one has ever heard before. It would be kind of like us sending a spaceship out into space, and we're encountering people or beings, and we don't have any means of seeing them. All we're doing is we're getting illustrations sent back on parchment, or we're getting stories sent back of sea monsters and people that are 20 feet tall, and we don't really know what's going on out there. So the church was kind of scrambling. What are these people? What are, blah, blah, blah. And eventually, of course, they realized they were, but by that point, this kind of imperialism, this colonialization, had just gone too far, of course, and it led to a whole range of evils like slavery, just the impoverishment of these different countries and the destruction of their original cultures, the things that are good in these cultures. So the Catholic Church was always ahead of the curve. This is actually throughout history, but I think especially in that era of imperialism, was always ahead of the curve. In other words, they were always a step ahead of everyone else, but they're not where we are today. That's kind of something that you have to keep in mind when you're looking at the Catholic Church throughout history. They're always ahead of the people at that time, but they're not where we want them to be. You've got some really jerky popes and bishops, well, not popes, but you certainly had some bishops there who at least turned a blind eye to some of the horrors at that time. And then, of course, at the same time, you had popes speaking out very forcefully against colonization, very forcefully against slavery, excommunicating slavers and things like that. So it was a mixed bag, but it's something that we as Catholics can't deny or try to hide. We have to be honest with our history. So, with that aside, we've gone through the 1800s, 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, the 20th century. The Catholic Church, it had opposed atheistic communism. It had stood up against this kind of industrial revolution gone wild. It had kind of recovered or developed this idea that every human being is unique and distinct and has dignity. And with that thought, it started the 20th century, which of course was the bloodiest century in human history. And so throughout the 20th century, the church was trying to come to terms with the idea that every human being is unique, and every human being has value because they are human beings, and not because a government says that they're valuable, or because a group of people says that they're valuable. And so this is a thought that is carried throughout the 20th century. But it's not only that. There are other things that came up. The 20th century was this explosion of technology. I mean, it's kind of it's not the dawn of the modern world, but in a way it kind of is. I mean, this is a world that just didn't exist before. And so by the end of the 20th century, the Catholic Church is trying to come to grips with the idea of how do we have this church, this 2,000-year-old religion, in the modern world. You've probably heard of the Second Vatican Council. That was convened in the early 60s, throughout the 60 to 64 or 61, I can't remember the exact dates, but around that time. And that was the purpose of it. The purpose of that was to look at how can we be Catholic, authentically Catholic, not compromised, but authentically Catholic, in this new world, in this modern world. What should be revised? What cannot be revised? Because it's part of what it means for us to be Catholic. And so we're still in the midst of that. We are still in this period. The Catholic Church has been around for a long time. It's the oldest, longest lasting organization in human history. And obviously doesn't have any indications that things are going to change. It just keeps kind of growing, which is awesome. But we are in this period. We're still struggling with what it means to be Catholic in the modern world. And so that's what the different popes, these last several popes, especially, of course, John Paul II, who was Pope for so long, that was one of the things that really drove him. And he had this burst of energy, and he, as Chris mentioned his presentation a few weeks ago. I mean, the Pope did all of these different things in these different areas, and of course Benedict is following up with the same thing. So these are kinds of the developments of the 20th century, and then also the idea that in the modern world, people should have religious freedom. I mean, this was not a thought earlier in the church, or it was debated, at least throughout history. And generally, for the most part, the church was not pro-religious freedom up until that point, because their thought was, this is truth that God revealed. And so denying the truth that God revealed is denying God. And so we didn't want to make room for that. Well, now we have a bit of a different view that people, can't be compelled, of course. People need to come to belief on their own. And if we're all going to live together in a kind of multi-religious society, we have to make room for other people and their own free choices. And so there is no end to this story. I mean, we are in the middle of it. We're in the middle of this developing time. So I don't have a, closer. The story continues. We're in chapter 5
to be continued.
Of an ongoing book that's constantly being written. So any questions?